All right, this is part 2 of the soil lecture. Part 1, we talked about sand, silt, and clay and what soil is. Here we're going to talk about soil horizons, the different characteristics of soil, and we're just going to barely touch on erosion. So, first of all, texture, structure, depth, and color. Texture, that's how much sand, silt, and clay is found in the soil. We kind of already talked about that. Sand, silt, clay. Sand's the biggest, clay's the smallest, silt is in the middle. All soils are a mixture of these three part sizes. Structure is a mixture of the soil and how the particles are arranged to make up the soil. Soil has different shapes. It forms different clods. This is the structure of the soil. It's not permanent. When it rains, when a tractor drives over it, when we have a football team run across it, when a pack of gazelles hops across the field, all of those things can change the soil structure. Depth, how deep horizon. Again, we're about to talk about horizons here. Lastly, color. Color can tell us what it's made of, how much it matters in it, what kind of minerals are in it, that sort of thing. Remember, if you need to pause to write things down, pause, write it down, and use notes on quizzes. Soil and its color. So if there's a lot of organic matter, which we call humus, it's really, really dark. I grew up in southern Minnesota. We had very, very dark soil. It's because it had a lot of organic matter in it. Up here, our soil is a lot more red, and that is, as you look down, because it's higher in iron. Has a really good drainage up here. It's kind of depends on how clayey it is. If you go out to the practice football field, not so much. But if it has that high iron and the ice particles, it will drain well. If it's gray soil, it tends to have poor drainage. And this is just 3 examples. Soil comes in many, 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 many different colors. There's something called the Munsell book, and that you can actually use to compare colors, and that'll tell you so much about soil. However, those books are like $1,000 and not something that I would invest in for a high school, but they're cool. So horizons, again, you don't have to write this slide down because we're going to go more in depth with each horizon. We've got the A horizon, which is also called topsoil. So spoiler alert, it's on top. We've got the B horizon, which, shocker, it's in the middle. We call it subsoil. And then the bottom is the C horizon. It's also the parent material. So the A horizon, the topsoil, it's generally only a few inches deep, but it can be feet. It's usually dark, and it's mostly organic matter. Now, depending on where you are, so this horizon will be varying depths. And by depending on where you are, I don't mean, northern Minnesota is always 2 inches deep, but in southern Minnesota, it's always 6 inches deep. And in Florida, it's always 8 inches deep. I mean, the practice football field has a different amount of topsoil than the actual football field. What else? Like, by a lake is going to have difference than your backyard. Every area is going to have different amounts of topsoil, subsoil, and depth to that sea horizon. There's also it's usually really dark in color. That's because it has the most organic matter out of all 3 of the soils. And yeah, it has the most organic matter. This is where most of your biological functions are taking place, just because it's towards a lot of oxygen. There's also fewer rocks in comparison to the B and C horizon. There are rocky soils, don't get me wrong, but in comparison to the B and the C horizon, there are fewer rocks in the A horizon than the B or C. So the B horizon, also known as the subsoil, it's low in organic matter. Doesn't mean non-existent organic matter. Some roots will make it that far, occasionally a few insects, but it tends to be really, really rocky. Not so rocky that roots can't get there, but it isn't as nice as our top soil or our A horizon. Our C horizon's really low in organic matter. It rarely has roots or biological activity. It's super rocky, not a whole lot of nutrients. It's not the ideal soil for growing. Now, erosion. Erosion is when soil is moved by water or wind. So this can happen naturally. It does happen naturally. However, some of human practices are speeding up this erosion. An example of it happening naturally is if you look at the Grand Canyon. Originally, there wasn't a canyon there. But the Colorado, I think, is the one that runs through that. Over thousands and thousands of years, dug through to create a canyon. This can be seen on smaller scales too, not necessarily as big as the Grand Canyon. Alternatively, if we think about the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, where at the time farmers were trying to maximize how much land they were using, so they would clear cut all the trees down, they would make these giant forests, or sorry, not giant forests, giant fields. They'd get rid of the forests, make these giant fields, and then a drought hit. When that drought hit, when the wind would come, the soil didn't have any water in it, didn't have enough weight to stay put, and just blew everywhere. And there was horrible, horrible erosion. There were dust storms. It was a bad deal. We've been fixing our since then, but erosion's still a very common problem. There's a lot of, it's bad. Okay, like we don't want erosion. And one of the questions that I had when I was thinking about erosion, I'm like, okay, but like the A horizon has to go somewhere. It doesn't just disappear forever. And it's like, no, it doesn't disappear forever. But what happens is, I have stuff written on the backboard. What happens is it more or less ends up in a pile. So say we have a hill and another hill. Yeah, beautiful drawing, right? And it rains, and so a bunch of soil runs down, and what happens is this valley gets filled with soil, and this hill no longer has any. So we end up with a thick layer of topsoil in one location instead of it spread out. So this area ends up kind of dead and devoid of plant life, and this area pretty much keeps the same amount of life in it because it can't support any more that has less surface area. So the topsoil doesn't just disappear, it just all kind of piles in one location, which is also unfortunate. So some results of erosion: losing topsoil, lowering crop yields, more commercial fertilizers. Because we have a lot less fertile land, we're putting on more fertilizers. Nutrient crops, formation of gullies. Gullies are like, I'm blanking now. So gullies are when like water will come through and like wash away a specific area, and they stink. And lastly, increased flooding. This is where we left off on Thursday, and where we're gonna jump back on Monday. So have a super fantabulous day, and take care of your soil.